Welcome, everyone. I'm Sue Keisler, Executive Director of xMinds, the organization hosting tonight's presentation. For those of you who aren't familiar with xMinds, we're a parent-led nonprofit dedicated to improving education for autistic students here in Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm very happy to very briefly introduce tonight's three speakers. Marcy Skegan is an executive functioning specialist, educational therapist, special education advocate, and founder of Enhance EFS. She's also a valued member of the xMinds board. Rachel Sushner is an executive functioning specialist, educational therapist, and college consultant, also at Enhance EFS. Our third panelist, Naomi Rubenstein, is a family educator and social learning specialist at Naomi Rubenstein, LLC. These panelists will explain the various types of service plans that provide support for our kids in school. They'll compare IEPs and 504s, as well as some other plans that get less attention. And our panelists will also discuss the common accommodations and modifications that these plans can offer for students, particularly students on the autism spectrum. This is the third in a series we're calling Special Education Basics. It's our effort to meet the needs of parents who can benefit from foundational information about navigating special education in Montgomery County. Tackling one topic at a time, it's our hope that this series will help parents to advocate effectively at school so they can be sure that their child's special education needs are being met. This series will be continuing with monthly presentations throughout this school year, always on the first Tuesday of each month. Today is an exception. This is the second Tuesday of January, but we pushed it back because of the holidays. Before we start tonight's presentation, I want to quickly mention three housekeeping items. First, simultaneous interpretation in Spanish is available. If you want to listen in Spanish, please select the interpretation button on the Zoom menu. We'll be recording this in both English and Spanish. Two, audience members, please keep your microphones muted. This is not a webinar, it's a meeting. So that means that you do have the ability to unmute. So please be careful not to do that accidentally. And third, this presentation goes to 9 p.m., but you won't have to wait until the end to ask your questions. Our panelists will take the questions at various designated points throughout the presentation. You'll be able to ask your questions out loud at those times, but by raising your hand and being called on. And if you're more comfortable writing your questions in the chat, you can do that at any time. I want to also mention that helping with the presentation tonight, we have Annie Pruitt monitoring the chat. We have Nora Dudwick monitoring the questions and answers. Carolina Harp will be translating any questions that parents have written in Spanish into the chat. And our wonderful Fabrizia Ferrari will provide simultaneous interpretation. So this is very much a team effort. Marcy, Rachel, and Naomi, thanks so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you now, Marcy.
Thank you, Sue. We are absolutely thrilled and delighted to be here. And now that Sue has shared a little bit about who we are, we would love to find out who is here with us today. Now, we realized it would take up a lot of time to call out every single person here with us today. So in a moment, if you're comfortable, we would like to ask your assistance in creating what we call the waterfall effect in the chat. If you choose to participate, and you don't have to, but if you would like to, we ask that you hold your answer until we get through the questions on the next slide. Rachel, if you could go ahead and get through the slide. In the chat, please share one. You can just, you're gonna hit the number 1 if you're a preschool parent, 2 if you're an elementary school parent, 3 if you're a middle school parent, and 4 if you're a high school parent. If you have multiple students, you could go ahead and hit different numbers. Okay, on your mark, get set, go. And as you can see, we have tons of different parents here. And I appreciate, I see some people have put in a 0 if they're different professionals, which I appreciate too. Thank you for doing that. Okay, we're going to give people a couple more seconds to go ahead and put in. And I love this because I can already see that we have a wide range across the board of parents here in all 4 of the different domains. So I really appreciate that. So that's terrific, which is really helpful for us to know. We're going to ask one more question, and feel free to keep adding to those numbers. We're taking a look at them as they're coming in. If you're game in assisting us one more time in learning about our audience, we ask that you help us out and please telling us the type of plan that your child has. Again, only if you're comfortable. 0, if your child has no plan or your children have no plan. 1, if they have an individualized family support plan, which is an IFSP. 2, if they have an individualized education plan, an IEP. 3, if they have a 504 plan. 4, if they have an individual service plan, an ISP. And we'll go ahead again and give people time to put that in the chat. And again, thank you to Annie for going ahead and putting our directions in there in Spanish as well. We appreciate that. We're going to give people a couple more seconds here. And again, this is only for people who feel comfortable putting that in. We understand those who don't feel as comfortable. Okay, and again, we're seeing that we have people that are representing all different kinds of plans, it looks like, which is also helpful to us to see. So I think that it's going to be, the information that we're sharing tonight is going to be helpful to all across the board, which is great. Okay, so Rachel, if you could continue. Our goal this evening is that you will leave with a working understanding of the following. You will leave with an understanding of what a individualized family service plan is, which is that IFSP, if you don't already know what that is. An individualized education plan, IEP, individualized service plan, ISP, a 504 plan. You'll leave with an understanding of an awareness for which plan may be best for your child, and an understanding of the differences between accommodations and modifications. And as Sue shared, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and obtain answers. And as we mentioned, there's going to be different times throughout the session and our presentation for you to ask that. But if you're thinking about them as we're speaking, feel free to go ahead and throw them directly into the chat. As we get to the end of each section, we're going to pause and take a moment to read through those questions. So don't worry, we will absolutely get there. The first set of slides that Rachel and I are going to go through is to discuss the differences between a 504 plan and an individualized education plan, an IEP. To assist in highlighting the discrepancies between the two plans, Rachel will speak about information regarding 504 plans, while I will speak to the IEP plans. Rachel, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to you.
Sure. Okay, so we thought that the best way to kind of present this information, as Marcy said, I'll speak to the 504s and we'll present them in this table format with the guiding questions that you'll see throughout the evening. So first, simply, we're going to talk about what is a 504 plan. A 504, it's a fluid support plan. It addresses barriers to learning. It contains accommodations and support. The main thing a 504 plan does is it makes changes at school so your child can learn. We're not going to get into the roots of the law, which covers a 504, but I do want to just share briefly. It gets its name because it is covered by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, just for informational purposes, which is a civil rights law. And the purpose of this is to prevent discrimination. And so it gives students access to the same education that their peers are getting. Primarily what this will look like is a list of accommodations, some of which may be surprising, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. Toss it over to you, Marcy.
And then we move to an IEP. An IEP is a more comprehensive plan that's created by the special education team at the school, and it outlines a student's special education experience within a public school. It contains goals and objectives, accommodations and modifications, related services such as speech and language, occupational therapy, social work, and then a behavioral plan if it's applicable.
Okay, so who's eligible? So for a 504, a student who is eligible for a 504 is a student with a disability that limits one or more basic learning activities. Disability is much more broadly defined with the 504 than it is on the IEP, which Marcy will speak to. So for those of you who are familiar with some of the IEP disability categories, this is much more broad. It can include a medical diagnosis, for example. A student might have a 504 because of food allergies, asthma, vision impairment, in addition to other disabilities. So it's not limited by the 13, it's a little bit wider. And the disability needs to interfere with a child's ability to learn in the general education classroom. The school will evaluate eligibility, and often it's often suggested for students who don't qualify for special education, but would benefit from some additional support.
Okay, and then we move over to the IEP. This is for students ages 3 to 21 who have one or more of the 13 disabilities listed in IDEA, including autism, specific learning disability, other health impairments, speech and language impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual and hearing impairment, just to name a few. The disability must affect the child's educational performance and/or their ability to learn and benefit from the general education curriculum. It can present as a social, emotional need, and a child must require specialized instruction to make progress. So one of the 13 disabilities alone without educational impact may not result in an IEP. I also want to take a moment just to note that while we put ages 3 to 21, if a student, they will either qualify or the end of the IEP will happen once they turn 22 or if they graduate with a diploma. So I just wanted to make a special note of that because we didn't put that in there.
Okay. And what can you expect? If your child has a 504, as I mentioned before, that typically is going to contain a list of specific accommodations and supports. And some of those might be a little bit surprising. So if we think about things like chewing gum in class, we think beyond some of the accommodations that we typically think of, like extended time or alternate seating, some examples of other accommodations that you might find on a 504, or maybe the ability to use a phone to take a picture of the board or record assignments. And so you can expect a list of specific accommodations. You can expect to have the name of the person responsible for ensuring implementation, the location of that support. There will be an annual meeting to determine continuation of the plan. And of course, this plan is free for the family. And just to know, there are less rights for the parents in the 504 than there are for the IEP. And so I think that that is a big distinguishing factor. And that is simply because of the roots of these plans and the legislation that they cover, fall under. But there are less rights for the parent with the 504, and it's important to note that.
With an IEP, you can expect quarterly progress updates on goals and objectives that are generally emailed to the parent. You can expect at least one annual meeting, although you can always request more meetings throughout the year, and occasionally the school will provide more as well. There will be a case manager that's assigned to your student. The duration and the frequency of services are written into the plan, and of how often they will occur and how long that they will last. And lastly, the IEP services are free for the family as well. Okay, at this time, we're going to pause to take some time to answer questions that have been asked in the chat, if there are any, regarding information presented in this section. If you had not had a chance to do that, please take a moment to type your question into the chat, or feel free to raise your hand, and we're happy to take questions then.
Okay, so I will read a couple of the questions. One of the questions is, can a student have both programs, have both a 504 and an IEP? Naomi. Whoever wants to answer.
Naomi,
Marcy, I think
we can't hear you.
No, I was going to say, Marcy, I think you were taking the section, right?
Yep. So No, you can't have a 504 and an IEP at the same time.
Okay, and one other question that was submitted earlier, you've used the term accommodations and modification. Could you explain the difference between the two terms, and while you're at it, also explain the term intervention?
Sure. So I'm actually going to pause to answer that question until we get a little further along in our presentation, because we have a section where we're going to talk about accommodations and modifications, and I'd love to address that a little further down. And that's a really important question, and we're going to get there. I'm going to promise that.
Okay, that's all.
Okay. Okay.
So those are all the questions for now.
Okay, great. So Rachel, do you want to share
Sure.
the next slide? So we're going to talk now, and I just want to say I'm really happy to be here and to see so many people here tonight. So we're going to talk now about individualized family service plans. And this is for children who are from birth through age 4. I did see in the waterfall answers in the chat that we do have some families who don't have a plan, but also some families who do have this plan. So we're going to delve into this plan a little bit. Thanks, Rachel. So what is it? Well, really, it is a document that identifies your child's needs. So what you're going to see in this plan is you're going to see your child's present levels of development. And usually what happens is that in the creation or prior to the creation of this plan, there's going to be some sort of evaluation done by Montgomery County Infants and Toddlers. So that there would be a team from Montgomery County Infants and Toddlers who would create this plan really with you. It's not just for your child, it's really with you as parents. So you're also going to see in this document, you're going to see the family's priorities. You're going to see special education and related services, like potentially speech therapy, occupational therapy, possibly a social worker or a psychologist. And then you'd also see the outcomes that are related to these services. This document is crafted usually by a multidisciplinary team. So as I mentioned before, the special educator, possibly a psychologist, possibly a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, would all be part of crafting this plan. It's going to identify the types of strategies and the activities that the team is going to utilize in order to accomplish the outcomes in the plan. It's going to communicate the timeline, what the team expects in terms of a reasonable time period for your child to reach the outcomes in the plan. And something really, really important to note about this particular plan is that there's a huge focus on the child and the whole family. And because of, and we're going to get a little more into it in the next slides, but it's a parent or caregiver coaching model. So what usually happens is the outcomes in the plan are really, really formed on a collaborative basis. So what's going to happen is you as the parent are going to have multiple conversations with this multidisciplinary team about what kinds of outcomes you think are important for your child. So the team might come in your home or go into the daycare center where your child is learning, and really think about what is the most challenging thing for your child? What are the hopes and what are the goals for your child? And it's really, they're formed based on this kind of collaborative process, which is really, really, I think, empowering to parents. So I think we're ready for the next slide. So we're going to talk about who's eligible. So children who are eligible are children birth through age 3. There is an option in certain circumstances to extend the IFSP through age 4. So in order to qualify for an IFSP, a child is going to fall under one of the following categories. The first category would be that the child is at least 25% delayed. And this would be based on standardized assessments, more informal assessments as well. And it would have to be, your child would have to be 25% delayed in at least one developmental area. The second way your child might qualify is if your child is identified as atypically developing in at least one developmental area. Now, I have to be totally honest with you. This is really subjective. It really depends on the team that you get through Montgomery County Infants and Toddlers. I'll give you an example of something. So it might be that your child is presenting with a lot of self-stimulating behaviors, and this is impacting their ability to be available in a variety of environments. So this might be a way that they qualify as atypically developing, but as I said, it's quite subjective. The final way that they would qualify is if they're at risk for a developmental disability due to a diagnosed condition. Now, I'll give you an example. So if you have a premature infant who was born at less than 1 pound, this would be one way potentially that they would be at risk for developing, being at risk for a developmental disability. And so they might qualify due to that. Or if they've been diagnosed with a genetic condition, if at birth the PKU was done and there was a genetic condition found on the PKU, then they might qualify for an IFSP. And I think we're ready for the next one. Thanks. So what can we expect as parents? So we can expect year-round early intervention services, as I mentioned before, through this parent caregiver model. It is free for the family. I also want to mention that it is year-round, but to be honest, from what I've seen in my experience, sometimes in the summer, you might end up with, you might have a speech therapist, for example, who's your regular ongoing speech therapist in the county. And in the summer, just because of the way summer works, you might have kind of contractors who work for the county filling in here and there. But during the school year, there generally should be a consistent person working with your child. It is, as I said, free for the family, and services are provided in the child's familiar environment. So this might be in your home, or if your child is in childcare from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., often the services will be provided in the childcare setting. And the speech therapist might go and work with the child in the setting. For example, if speech is a related service on the IFSP, and they would work then with that. It's that kind of caregiver model. So they might not be working with you in that moment. They'd be working with whoever's taking care of your child, but then you would then get a note home at the end of the day. In terms of accountability, I think all parents always want to know, well, how can I hold the county, make sure that they're doing exactly what they say they're going to do in this legal document. So this document is reviewed every 6 months or when an outcome, a goal is achieved. Or if you as a parent identify a new area of challenge, you certainly should and can bring this up with your child's IFSP team. And I think that's about it for that slide. So I think we can move on to any questions that anyone has. Do we have any questions, Sue?
I don't see any in the chat.
Okay.
So there is one. Oh. There is one. I just submitted.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. I'll read it. Okay. How do I go about getting my preschool child to receive more speech therapy or occupational therapy?
So that's a really good question. So if your child, it's hard to say, everything's on an individual basis, of course. But let's say, for example, your child has an IFSP, and on the IFSP, it says that your child is only getting speech therapy or occupational therapy twice monthly. And you feel like, this doesn't match up with your child, what was found on the standardized assessments, or even what you're seeing outside of school. Maybe, when your child was first evaluated by the county, the standard that they were looking at, because everything's always looked at, like they want to look at, what's expected for that developmental, time period. And if you find, like, for example, that, let's say your child has an articulation outcome, which for those of you who aren't familiar with articulation, it's really just how intelligible your child's speech is. So for example, let's say that at this developmental time, it's expected that you should be able at home to understand 60% of what your child is saying, but you can only understand still 20%. Well, you can ask for a meeting with the developmental team, and you can ask for them to reassess, and you can give them evidence. Maybe the evidence is, maybe you're taking a video of your child in certain situations. Maybe when the speech therapist is there, because the speech therapist is giving a lot of prompts and a lot of support, the speech therapist doesn't necessarily notice that intelligibility is lower than what she would expect, or the person would expect. But when your child is out and about in the community, the intelligibility is lower than when the speech therapist is there. So the speech therapist isn't necessarily seeing what you want the speech therapist to see. Maybe you take a video and you ask for a meeting and you say, look, this is the evidence I have that my child is not intelligible in all settings. So that would be an example. But of course, it's a case-by-case basis. And I think, it's a little bit tricky to kind of answer these questions, but to say, I think having as much evidence as possible is going to be your best friend. And if you're working, like, all of us have pediatricians. So I think it's always helpful to, talk to your pediatrician, ask your pediatrician to write a letter that, there's the big, I always say, the most you have to lose is your time, right? There's no harm in asking. There's no harm in having the conversation, but the more evidence that you have in your back pocket is going to be your best chance at getting those services. And don't be afraid to ask. I think communication is key. And what I feel is that, the practitioners are not seeing your child in every setting. You know your child better than anyone in the world. And if you feel that there's something going on that they're not aware of, it's really important to communicate that with the team. So I hope that helps. I hope that answers your question.
I think that's it for now.
Okay, I'm gonna pick back up and we're gonna talk about individualized service plans, which might more frequently be known as just a service plan. Sometimes they're called an instruction service plan. And the distinguishing factor between this document and the other ones that we've spoken about are these are designed for students who are private school students. And this is age 3 through high school, but this document is really for a student who is in private school. Okay, so what is this? I'm just going to call it a service plan because I think that's, if you talk about it, that's what's more frequently known. So a service plan is a plan provided by the local school district for identified students who attend private school. As we've said, it is less comprehensive than an IEP. It only includes resource and speech services. And it's important to note this, that if you are the parent of a child who is in private school and does have a service plan, you will not find OT or PT on these service plans. And it is possible that it will include goals and objectives. Private schools can offer special education, but they're not required to by law. And so this is a distinguishing factor. That being said, IDEA, without getting into the details of the law, does require that local educational agencies set aside funding for students with disabilities for those parents who choose to send them to private school. And so that's kind of this bucket of people who would be eligible for a service plan. And local is kind of a tricky word because it's not defined the same everywhere. It could be the state, it could be regional, it could be very individual according to that child. So there's a little bit of a tricky plan in that regard. Who is eligible? As we've said, students in private school who have, similar to the IEP, they have one or more of the 13 disabilities that are listed in IDEA. They're aged 3 to 21. They have a disability that affects their educational performance or ability to learn and benefit from the general education curriculum. And they require specialized instruction to make progress. It's fairly straightforward. It's really the distinguishing factor is that these are private school students. And I do want to just note, this does not mean students who are placed by the county in a private school setting, because there are situations where the private school will place and fund a student who is in a private school, for example, Ivy Mount. This is different. This is if you as a parent have chosen to place your child in, for example, the McLean School, and your child is still eligible for services. And I think I'm just seeing that question, Sue, is ISP for students who are publicly funded and have a private placement. So it is not. I got that came in right as I was saying that. It's a great question. It's a little confusing. A student who has been publicly funded and is in a private placement will have a full IEP, and that private school will be required by law to follow the IEP. So this is a little bit different. This is, again, the parents who are choosing to have the private school. What can you expect if your child has a service plan? I think the service plan is tricky in terms of this first one. It is very possible that a student will be required to travel to a public school for those services. So if your child has been deemed eligible for example, resource services, and Montgomery County Public Schools has offered to send out an itinerant resource teacher to work with your child. I'm sorry, not send out. I'm going to catch myself there. They have been slated for work with an itinerant resource teacher. It is very likely that your child will have to travel to the home school or a school near their private school location to receive those services. Transportation is provided by the school district. So an MCPS bus will show up at 10:30 in the morning, pick up that child, bring them over to wherever school they are receiving their resource or their speech services. In some cases, when there is like a pod of students at a private school who have service plans and are eligible, for example, speech therapy, this is what I've seen most frequently. MCPS will actually assign a speech therapist to go and work on site at that private school for one morning a week, one day a week, depending on the caseload. So it is possible that if your child is at a private school where there is a large level of eligibility in terms of service plans, that they will actually send somebody to the school, but it is not a guarantee. But you can expect progress updates on goals and objectives at an annual meeting, similar to the IEP. It is free. And I think, in explaining some of the logistics of this plan, it's important to note that if you have a service plan for your child, it can be a little bit disruptive to the student's class schedule, particularly if MCPS is not able to send a service provider out to your school, your child's school setting. When MCPS can offer that service for your child, it may fall in the middle of their special or whatever academic class. And so it is really tricky and super important that you remain engaged and collaborate both with your private school and with your MCPS service providers to try and make that as minimally disruptive as possible. But it is important to note that. I noticed a question came in. I don't know if it was related to this or something else.
Yes, and we also have a hand raise as well.
Okay. It looks like the question is maybe more preschool related, Naomi. So I'm just wondering if the hand raise is a question about the service plan, since we're on that.
Yeah.
Maybe Trisha?
Yes, this is Trisha.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. My son is in private school. He had an IEP last year, and this is his first year in the private school. So, they gave us certain accommodations, but, in following what you were saying, the problem I was having, because the woman from Montgomery County actually comes to our school, because I guess other kids are there too, but it was the timing of it. I have him in private everything, including speech, and they were offering speech at school. So I thought, okay, why not just do extra speech at school? But he was being taken out of social studies and he was complaining about it. So I had to stop it. So I told the woman to stop. So my question is, have I jeopardized anything? Like, if he needs in the future to do it again or whatever, am I going to be like, oh, well, you stopped it,
No.
and you can't do it anymore?
Okay, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I'm done. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's a great question. And I think like your situation really highlights some of that logistical challenge, which is so unfortunate. It's really tricky, but no, you haven't jeopardized that. I would remain engaged and continue to, they should still, does he receive any other services? Like, is there anything else besides speech on the service plan?
No, it was speech when he started. And then last year, like in March, he was diagnosed with autism.
Okay.
So then they didn't really do much, because the school year was ending when I got the diagnosis, but I wanted to put it in the IEP before we left school, because I knew we were going to private school. So I had them added in, but I don't know, like, I was just like, it didn't really say much. It was kind of like, oh yeah, he's got autism, we'll, whatever. Because I think when I told them I was going to private school, they're like, great, here, like kind of shoved me off to the private school. And then private school was kind of like, yeah, we'll do some accommodations. I don't know what you need. I mean, he's high functioning, so it's not like he needs, speech is his main thing, like articulation. So that was what he was working on at school, in public school as well as here. But he has other therapies outside of school, like OT and stuff. I just pay for it on my own with my insurance and things. So they don't have to be burdened with all that. But I was just kind of concerned because, and he's a twin, and his twin sister has sensory processing disorder, which was diagnosed. And they told me, we can't do one for you.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm supposed to have one for her because it is a diagnosis, but right now she doesn't have one. And again, it's like, they're very high functioning. I mean, she's borderline genius. So the private school is like, well, she doesn't really seem to have any problems other than these sensory things. So they didn't bother. So I don't know if I have the right to say you need to bother or,
So I think your question is great. I can tell you're speaking from a lot of experience, and kudos to you for following up on all the services for your child, for both of your children. I think some of that is really specific and I think hard to answer in this general setting, but in a very quick nutshell to your question, you haven't jeopardized anything. If you are a parent of a child who you are choosing to place in a private school, it is always recommended that you maintain the service plan so that you can just engage with the county. But at any point, you could re-engage with the service plan, but it's always a good idea to just maintain and attend those annual meetings, even if you're not accessing a service at that moment, particularly in a circumstance where there's actually a service provider who's coming out to the school, which means there should be a little bit more familiarity with this process, and there should be a little bit more like partnership and maybe collaboration that hopefully you can advocate for. So you haven't done anything, but I think the specifics of your question, we're happy to like talk offline later.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. A great question though.
Do you mind if I just add one more thing?
Sure.
I also just wanted to say to the parent that, again, it's a specific question, but in general, if something isn't working, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to cut off the service. It might be just kind of like to Rachel's point, think like somehow they might be able to think outside of the box for you, and it might be too much to then go to your home school. But typically that is an option. Typically, if the provider is coming at that specific time, it's because the provider is coming from the home school and has a caseload at that home school and can only go at that time. But there might be a way, I guess my point is there might be a way to then like maybe you bring him there or anyway, but I wouldn't necessarily, as Rachel said, you're not jeopardizing anything, but at the same time I wouldn't necessarily give up the service. Anyway, I wanted to, is it okay, Rachel, if
Sure.
the preschool question is actually kind of slash ISP question. So I just want to address it since we're talking about ISP.
Sure.
So the parent asked if the parent said, I didn't think public preschool was available to all children in Maryland, and do all 3 to 4 year olds then receive an ISP rather than an IEP? So that's a really good question. So there was a 2-part question. So that's the first part to the question. So public preschool is not available to all children in Maryland. There are some pre-K programs in specific schools. And then what typically happens is some children, if they have an IEP that states that they have enough, they need enough support to, and they need support that would best be, your child would best be supported in a preschool education program, that would be on an IEP. You can then have an IEP in preschool and get something called itinerant services if your child is in a private school. This is where someone from the county, a specialist or special educator, goes into the private school. The child can still have an IEP though. And then the second part to the question is, does the county consider whether you plan to send your child to public versus private kindergarten and make the determination of ISP versus IEP? And the answer is no. Typically what happens is a parent asks, like, let's say your child has an IEP, it's really up to you to say, my child's going to private school, I would like to switch for to an ISP. Keep in mind though, if you switch from an IEP to an ISP, you can't get the full gamut of the full range of services that you're going to get in IEP. You're only going to be able to access typically speech and resource. I hope that answered your question.
The one thing I'll just add, if you have a service plan and you maintain that, then at triennial evaluation time, you might be able to request an evaluation for your child. So that is another benefit if you are a parent who has privately placed your child into private school. I did see there was another question. What would it take to transfer my son to Ivy Mount from public school? He has autism, 9th grade in public school. Okay. It's a good question. It's very individual. You know, I think that there isn't like a set process for that transfer. This service plan is, again, for parents who have chosen already to place their children in a private school setting. And so certainly at any point, I know it's a tremendous cost to the parents, so I want to recognize that, but at any point, a parent could choose to place their child into a private school and continue to access whatever level of support is available. You know, depending on how close, I think it's such a specific question, to be totally honest. I think engaging with your team, your IEP team right now to address some of the concerns if you feel like your child is not making adequate progress. And again, I just think back to the documentation that we were discussing and talking about, making sure that you are documenting that. I guess without understanding the specific concerns or maybe the kind of root cause for why, it's a little bit tricky to answer that question generally. I don't know if Naomi or Marcy want to chime in any more specifically on that.
Marcy, did you want to respond? I was just gonna, I think generally, you know, it is really specific. I think, you know, all 3 of us would be happy to talk to you offline. There is an answer to that question. There definitely are avenues to hopefully get there depending on the circumstances, but it's individualized.
Okay. Any other questions pertaining? Okay.
Do you see the question from Grace?
Oh, okay, I see. Okay, how can I advocate for my child that small group is a necessity for him to learn? I'm looking for placement in middle school. Does your child already have an IEP? This could be an accommodations, you know, a small group structure. So I guess a little bit more information, but again, it's going to be a highly individualized response. And I'm sorry if we sound like a broken record in that regard, but this might also be a good question to chat about a little bit, later offline. All three of us will share our contact information and are happy to answer any questions. But when it gets into the super specifics, we'd love to answer every single question here tonight, but without a little bit more detail, it's hard to give you a
I
quick
think in this
response to that.
particular case, with a small group, it would be a matter of, are we talking about a small group as far as a classroom, or a small group, are we looking for an accommodation? So I think it would be important to know a little bit more information on that. So again, I would echo your response, Rachel, that we would need a little bit more information there.
But our contact information is here at the end. So
Absolutely.
I apologize if we all sound like broken records, but in the interest to the general public, we do want to provide some more global general information. And absolutely, we're happy to answer any of these questions.
And
offline.
at the very end, we are going to provide some tips for parents that will acknowledge some of these questions about being able to advocate for your child. So hang in there, we're going to get there.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna toss it back over to Marcy.
Okay, so as promised, we are going to talk about accommodations and modifications. The terms accommodations and modifications are so often confused. Some people tend to use these terms as if they're synonyms for one another, but as you will hear, this is incorrect. They actually have their own meaning and they fulfill their own jobs. And when I say they're confused, they're not just confused by parents. I've actually walked into classrooms where they're confused by teachers, they're confused in special education meetings. So please know that even colleagues, sometimes when they're talking, it gets confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually read through the definitions of each. Then afterwards, to make it even clearer, Rachel, Naomi, and I are going to present some specific examples of learning barriers, accommodations, and modifications that you're going to find in a school setting. So we're going to first start with accommodations. And again, hang in there while I just review the definitions of what it is. So accommodations enable equitable access to instruction. It levels the playing field. Accommodations are changes in how, instead of what, the student learns or accesses the material. So it's how the student, again, I'm just going to really push that word how, the student learns or accesses the material. Accommodations are changes in things like timing, formatting, setting, scheduling, response, and or presentation. Now we're going to jump down to modification for a second. So modifications are changes in what, not how, but what the student is taught or expected to learn. Modifications are provided to students who require additional support to accommodations. Modifications can be used in conjunction with accommodations. So again, different, but they can be used together. Modifications are changes in content rigor, test, and assignment expectations and academic standards. Okay, and then before we talk about one other thing, I want to talk about interventions because I know that that was a question that came up earlier, and as promised, I want to make sure I answer it. So someone had asked a question earlier about, well, what's the difference between an accommodation, a modification, and an intervention? So an intervention targets a specific skill using evidence-based strategies and techniques. So interventions are used to teach the skills that a student needs to improve on a specific area of weakness. So, and once that skill is learned, then the intervention typically ends, where an accommodation or a modification might continue with the student throughout their 504 plan or their IEP plan. So that's the difference between an accommodation and modification and an intervention. Rachel, if you could switch the slide for me, please. So now what I'm going to do is Naomi's going to start by taking us through barrier to learning, accommodation, and modification. And we're going to start in preschool. And then after she goes through preschool, we're going to move to elementary school, middle school, and then high school. Okay, just to give you examples of how these accommodations and modifications look across the board. Naomi?
Great, thanks, Marcy. So what I do want to just start by saying that, as Marcy said, these are just examples and they're in isolation. So they're not any one particular kiddo. But I think what we do need to keep in mind is that everything, as you know, on an IEP is going to be individualized. So when we list a barrier to learning and a particular modification or an accommodation to support it, we would need more than just what that one particular barrier to learning. It would be kind of in terms of looking at the whole child, that these modifications and accommodations would be appropriate, but we just want to link them so that you have an idea of what you might expect if you have one particular barrier to learning. So this chart lists a bunch, but we're going to focus on first classroom instruction. So during classroom instruction, your child might have difficulty shifting attention. So this might mean difficulty shifting attention from one task to the other, difficulty shifting attention from one object or one person to another person. One accommodation that would address this would be priming before a change in schedule. So let's say, I'll use my son's name. Let's say my son, Sam, is, having difficulty shifting attention from one activity to the other, and there's a new activity coming up that he hasn't experienced before, and this might make him uncomfortable. So that the difficulty with the shift can be supported with this priming. What priming is basically previewing something before it happens. So one way that you might see this in a classroom is you might see, for example, and I don't know how well you can see this picture, but this is a social, this isn't really working, but this is a social story. Apparently my camera isn't as good as I think it is. This is a social story that I made for one of my little friends about going on an airplane for the first time. In school, it might be going to the auditorium or the cafeteria for the first time for an assembly. So priming would look like this. Sam, today, let's look at the visual schedule. Today is going to be a little bit different. Usually after lunch, we go outside to the playground for recess, but today we're actually going to go into the auditorium to learn about reptiles. And this is what is expected when we get to the auditorium. When we get there, everyone's going to be sitting crisscross applesauce. Your body is going to be on the floor sitting crisscross applesauce. So it's just a way to help preview with the child what is going to happen so they have an easier time shifting. One modification that you might have on an IEP for this difficulty shifting is reducing the number of steps in a task. This also would help to decrease the anxiety for a lot of kids as well. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is looking at centers. And if you're not familiar with what a center is, it's basically an activity, and usually during center time in a classroom, in the preschool classroom, kids are going from one activity center to another activity center. Well, if your child's barrier to learning is maybe they get overwhelmed by a perceived amount of work, not necessarily the actual amount of work, but different kids have different feelings about what they think they can handle and what they can't handle and what's too much for them. And so one way to address this is to utilize something called a choice board. So again, I'm going to try on but this camera's better. So let's say I have a little board and it has a picture of two choices. A child who is either nonverbal or isn't available in that moment to use language can simply point to one versus another of what they want. So this will help with the perceived amount of the work. A modification that can be used to address this is to simply reduce the workload at the center. So let's say at one particular center, the children in that group are expected to string beads. And it's expected that all of the children string between 15 and 20 beads, but your child might get overwhelmed simply by seeing the 15 or 20 beads on the table. So simply saying, okay, Sam, today do you want to string 4 beads or do you want to string 5 beads instead of the 20 beads that his classmates are stringing? So let's just think about specials. So for example, in physical education, your child might get overwhelmed by the difficulty, again, the perceived difficulty. Sometimes it's the actual difficulty, and sometimes it's the perceived difficulty of the activity. One way to accommodate this would be to limit the amount of information shown or the directions given at once. So let's say the physical education teacher has pictures of activities, and I'm just going to give you an example of one of my boards. And let's say there are, 4 pictures on this sheet. That might be overwhelming. The teacher can simply go like this, just cover, or even fold it, or even simply take their hand and cover it. Like, that's one way a teacher might choose to do that. They might do it another way, but that's just one example of what's used in the kind of strategy that you would see in a preschool classroom. If you want to modify it, it would be maybe it would be modifying the actual physical activity for the child, or if that particular physical activity is too challenging or inappropriate for that child, then you would give the child an alternate physical activity. And I think that Rachel is going to walk us through the elementary school accommodations and modifications next.
To unmute in order to have you all hear me. Apologies. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at elementary school, and using the same table format, which I know is like a lot of information thrown at you. So we tried to bold the one that we'll highlight, but please feel free to read the rest of the information on there, because these are just snapshots, and often there are multiple accommodations. And as Marcy shared, accommodations may be used in conjunction with modifications. So just to kind of paint that picture, and to further kind of make this even more specific with this elementary school student, because there are so many needs that may present for a student to benefit from an accommodation or a modification, we're going to look at some sensory difficulties. So we're going to look across those similar buckets, like these 3 categories. So the first one is classroom instruction. You can picture like a 3rd grade classroom. They are learning geography, and a student who has a sensory sensitivity, and they are really sensitive to like a physical sensitivity. It's possible that an accommodation that may be used is a weighted sensory pad, because they're feeling really uncomfortable in that chair that they're sitting in. It's that plastic is like rubbing up against their back, and it's really bothering them, and all they can think about is that sensation that they are sitting in. And something like a weighted sensory pad to rest across their lap might just kind of bring down, soothe them a little bit, and allow them to engage in that geography lesson. An example of a modification that pertains to like this level of physical sensitivity that might present from a sensory standpoint is actually an alternate assignment. So following that geography lesson, the students are all making a model with clay. Now that student does not want to stick their hands in the clay. Like that is like, that's not happening. And so perhaps the teacher actually changes the assignment for that student, and instead of the model that they're creating, they're drawing the model that the students are doing with paper and pencil. So an example of a modification. When it comes to a test, we also know that lights can be incredibly overwhelming for students. And there are a number of lighting changes that can be made in a classroom. I don't know if you've ever walked into a lower school classroom and seen overlays on fluorescent lights to kind of tone down that really sharp and bright light for students. That can be, again, just overwhelming, especially when we're asking them to sit down and take a test. Also, teachers can use low-level lights like lamps and just actually shut off the fluorescent lights altogether. And then it is possible that even with those accommodations in place, a student is still working so hard to manage that sensory overload from the light and the stimulation, even with some of those accommodations, that they actually are just not able to engage or focus on the quiz for as long as their peers, and the teacher might choose to reduce the content on the test. So instead of asking, answering 10 geography questions, they're going to answer 5. And so that would be an example of a modification in that test setting. And then finally, we are going to explore the special category, and we're going to use art as the example. Art is usually a little bit more loose. There's maybe a little bit more noise because the teacher wants to create a creative space to express themselves as students. But that loud noise is really bothersome to the student who has some sensory processing difficulties. Noise canceling headphones, and there are so many out there right now, are great. There are so many that are discreet. Even the big ones are kind of cool now. So they're not even, kids don't mind walking around with the large headphones, but noise canceling headphones are a great tool for students who struggle with that overstimulation from an auditory perspective. And if even further, the student, even with those noise canceling headphones, if they're still struggling, the teacher might actually change or provide an alternate assignment. So just as an example, maybe instead of weaving the basket with reeds, because again, like they're overloaded by this whole process, taking in the noises, and maybe we're pairing some of the other difficulties too in here as well, some of the other sensory sensitivities. They might have them draw the basket on paper or paint it, or use another mode to produce that same product or similar product. Next, we're going to take a look at middle school. And for this one, we're going to highlight curricular areas. So okay, so we're going to start with classroom instruction. So you can imagine a middle school classroom, maybe they are learning pre-algebra, and the student is just having a lot of difficulty with attention and focus, and they are procrastinating, and they have pushed off that assignment, they've pushed it away. What can the teacher do? What is an accommodation a teacher can put in place to help them manage that review sheet that they have to get through? A common one that we'll see is chunking assignments with sub-deadlines, breaking them down into smaller parts, so that the student can more easily manage that larger task of filling out that pre-algebra review sheet. It is possible that even with that accommodation, that a student will require some changes to the instruction. And so the teacher might actually choose to pace the learning differently. And that would be often results in an alternate grading standard for that student, but they might actually cut out some of the pre-algebra material on that review sheet and reduce some of that content and pace the structure of that learning a little bit differently for that student. On a classroom test, you might have the student who, again, that ADHD student is just not able to sit still for that whole 45-minute period where they're expected to sit down and take a test. So a great accommodation that teachers can put in place is breaks between each test section. Sometimes just similar, pairing it with the chunking that we talked about before, maybe giving the student one section at a time, and then also pairing that with breaks. There are so many things. You could have all of these accommodations in place at the same time, assuming that the resources are there to help provide them. And then if that is still not enough, it is possible that the student would benefit from reduced content on that test. And if we take a look at specials, we're going to use PE as the example. Our student who's a little disorganized and scattered, hasn't properly prepared, and so they didn't bring their PE shorts that they have to wear. So perhaps an accommodation that can be explored is providing a visual model of steps and directions, or just writing out the steps, a checklist, so that they remember that they need to put the picture of their shorts and next to their right on the way out the door, so that they can remember to bring the gym shorts with them. It is possible that the teacher might actually modify the activity and provide alternate activities for a student in PE if that was necessary.
Okay, so now we are going to welcome to high school, friends. We are now moving into hormones, homework, hairspray, and what I like to call, we've got to keep humor. And I say this because I am a parent of 4 teenagers. And I definitely need to remember to have my humor with me at all times. So now we're going to address high school students where attention and focus can be challenging. So when we, like Naomi, I'm actually going to use one of my children's names to kind of help walk us through this. So we're going to use my child, Jack, and he is an autistic student who is also diagnosed with ADHD. And some of his current classes are lit, creative writing, chemistry, NSL. Sometimes he struggles to remain focused in class and sustain attention. And some of the barriers to learning that he has faced, and again, some of these are not directly with him, I'm just using him loosely as an example, are that expectations can be too high in finishing multiple assignments within a given time period. And so sometimes he asks for an accommodation to help structure that time, or a system to help structure that time. One of the things that he can use is a timer to help manage to complete those tasks. Now, there are such things like cube timers that he could use to put on his desk. We can use an analog clock that he could. We don't want to use a great big one, but we can certainly use a small one. But most high school students actually just feel comfortable with their cell phone, where they can just set their alarms and put on, how long they want to, they think an assignment might take. And they can practice estimating their time about how long they think something will take, and then they can actually see if that matched up with how long the assignment took. And they're allowed to use their cell phone in class, where they might not necessarily, a student might not necessarily be on a regular basis. And then when we move over to modification, we can always adjust the homework or the class assignment, reducing the amount of problems on the page, or adjusting the number of assignments that are required. Another barrier to learning that he might face is difficulty sitting for long periods of time. And in that case, an accommodation might be flexible seating options. Again, if we were looking at a student that was younger, we might talk about a seating wedge. We might talk about bands on a chair. We might talk about a large bouncy ball to sit on. But with a student that's in high school, instead, we might talk about a standing desk. Something that's more age appropriate for him, which is a flexible seating option that we see in high school. When we go over to the modification side, we might reduce the content on a test so that he doesn't have to sit for as long of a period of time, but we're still able to assess what it is that he knows and only ask those questions that will still allow us to gauge that he knows the material. And then when we look at specials like music, sometimes he might say to us, well, in some classrooms, that routine is too rigid, and sometimes it's too lenient. So maybe that teacher provides a visual schedule, and they put up on, and I think Naomi spoke to this earlier as well, but instead of maybe a picture schedule, it just might be that the teacher writes up on the board what the syllabus or what the agenda for the day is. And then he's able to know what's coming, and maybe even the time that we're going to do this from this to this time, this from this to this time. So he knows what's expected of him. And then, of course, the modification would be an alternate assessment of standards, so that we can take a look at how we're going to assess how he's able to complete those routines. And I want to address, I saw I'm just going to take a moment to address a couple of the questions that we had, that modifications for children in high school. So can they be applied to students who are diploma bound? And the answer is Absolutely. Yes, they can. You know, it will not take them out of the realm of being diploma bound. So, and I think that there was another question earlier on, and I want to make sure I addressed it correctly. So, Liz, if I'm not answering the question that you had, please feel free to go ahead and comment back to me. But if you're looking to figure out how to know when to ask for a modification, it's really when we're looking at accommodations. We're going to first look at accommodations, and we're going to see if they're working for us, or if they're working, I'm sorry, for the student. And then if we need to add more and into what they're doing, then we're going to, because and I want to just, Rachel, if you could jump back to the accommodations definition on your slides. I just want to go back because I want to hit that point again. Okay, thank you. So just a reminder, and accommodations are changes to how the student learns, okay, so that they're able to access the material. If that how isn't working, jump down to the modification slide, okay? And the modification is a change into what the student is taught to expect. So then we're going to add a modification to that. So then we're going to take the accommodation and we're going to add on so that they can now work in conjunction with each other. So we're not just going to start with a modification. Generally, that doesn't happen. We're going to first start with some accommodations because we want to start with the least restrictive, okay, and then move to modifications. So, and I'm hoping that's answering your question. So if we want to jump back down, Rachel. Okay, so now this is something that I love to talk about, okay? So in the desire to gain as much support as we can for our child, you may inadvertently come across what I like to call the laundry list hazard, otherwise known as, instead of going to my child's IEP meeting, I went to Costco. So let me explain what I mean by that, okay? We generally, when you go into your child's special education meeting, you know that you only have an hour. And sometimes, and I know this from personal experience, I go in and even though I have my nice organized list as a executive functioning specialist, and I'm ready to roll and I feel very organized, I've got my binder, I've got everything set aside, I'm still anxious that I'm not going to get in everything that it is that I need to get in. And I want to make sure that my child has every support that they can possibly have because they're my baby. And I want to make sure that I give them absolutely everything that they need. Okay. Sort of like when I walk into Costco and I have my list and I know exactly what it is that I'm supposed to get. But instead, I walk out with a vacuum cleaner, a humongous box of cashews, chips that I know I shouldn't need, but I have, about 16 jars of spaghetti sauce, and a giant container of ranch dressing. Not sure why. And so what I want to make sure of is that when we choose accommodations, we as the team, parents included, we're choosing accommodations that are meaningful and relevant to the learning barriers that your child has, your individual child has. There are lists and lists of accommodations that you can pull up on the internet. There are lists and lists of accommodations that advocates can share with you. There are lists and lists that a tutor can give you, that teachers can give you, that teams can give you. They all sound fabulous, okay? But they're not necessarily meaningful and relevant to every individual child's learning barrier. We want to encourage you to make sure that when you're choosing and when your team is choosing accommodations, that they're choosing ones that help your child and encourage your child to become more self-aware, to become their biggest self-advocates, that we're reflecting on what's worked in the past for our child, if that's possible, if they've had one if they've had IEPs or plans previously, and if they can reflect on what's happening, and if they haven't, that they can reflect on what's happening in the classroom, and that you can help be their voice if they're not old enough to be in the meeting or they're with you, so that we can really determine the best fit for each of those accommodations. I hope that that was clear. Rachel and Naomi, feel free to jump in, because of course, when we get home from Costco and we have way too much, we sometimes aren't finding that we're really getting down to the nuts and bolts of what it is that we really need. And we want to make sure that's what we're doing.
I'll just jump in a little bit on that last bullet, the self-awareness, reflection, and self-advocacy. This is tricky across ages, because obviously we hope that as our children age, they develop a little bit more insight and awareness, but we also can see times when our children might say, I don't need that extended time, yet they're not finishing the test. And we can see pretty clearly that that would be an accommodation that would be helpful. And so we really encourage you, and we'll talk about a couple of tips later, but really encourage just on this one piece to check in with your kid. Ask them, like, is that accommodation helpful? Like when you do that pull out in the hallway, or you know, they have the extended time, or you know, they've whatever the accommodation might be, is that beneficial for your child? Typically, students will narrow it down as they get older to like one hand of accommodations that are really truly helpful for them. And that's really our goal, that ultimately over their years of schooling, that they develop some self-awareness, they reflect, they try things out, they evaluate them, and then they advocate for themselves. And so we would just encourage you to engage with your kids in that process and get feedback from your child's team, because we recognize that the child's perspective, while it's super, you can't have this conversation without their insight, and you also need to pair it with the professionals and your own insight and awareness of your child. Again, age and developmental appropriate at different ages and stages. But just to add that point of engaging with your child and getting feedback from them and talking to them about their experience.
And helping them to come up with a plan B. So if they're saying to you that if they don't need extended time, but yet they're not finishing things on time, letting them have an opportunity to share a potential plan B to extended time, giving them that opportunity to either A, come back around to, okay, well, extended time may be the right fit, or there is a plan B, and letting them talk it through with their team and being part of the team, or talking it through with you if they're of the younger age. So just keeping that in mind.
And if I may just add one point, just to kind of follow up on what I think both of you have said, is that for those of you who have younger kids, at a certain point, the school should be asking the child to attend, if they have an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting, should be asking the child to start attending those meetings gradually. And when they're like in the beginning of middle school, that should start to happen. So if that's the point where you are at now, or you're getting close to there, if a team member is not doing that, that's something you definitely should advocate for.
And generally in middle school, we see that there are some students that are not comfortable, or sometimes in middle school, I should say, there may be a time where your child is not comfortable. So sometimes what is helpful is having them join in for small portions of the meeting. And so that we're taking baby steps to have them join in for longer and longer periods of time. The teams are usually very professional in knowing what parts of the meeting are most beneficial for the students to attend. Okay.
And if you don't mind me adding one more thing, at the beginning of the school year, once you're in middle school, at the beginning of the school year, the case manager for your child should be pulling your child and conferencing with your child at the beginning of the school year to help your child understand the 504 or the IEP or the ISP, whatever plan your child has, so that your child, because your child needs to know. I mean, you can do it at home, but I find as a parent, it's much more impactful when a teacher does it. And it also allows them to build that rapport with your child as well.
Okay, so we have a couple questions in the chat. Is the case manager the school counselor? So case managers vary from school to school. So it can be, not necessarily is really the answer to that question. So it is really very dependent in in different schools. So you could have a guidance counselor, you could have a school counselor, there can be a special education team member. So in different schools, I've encountered different members of the team being the case manager. There is another question that Sue put in. If modifications are substantial enough, do they take the student out of grade level work? And if so, is there a concern that the student will not continue on track for a diploma? Again, this is a question. So let me answer. That's a two-part question, really. Okay, so if modifications are substantial enough, do they take the student out of grade level work? So if a modification is substantial enough, they are. It is my understanding that they're going to. They will make it so that the curriculum fits the child. They will meet the child where this child is at. Now, is there a concern that the student will not continue on track for a diploma? That's too difficult for me to answer because I need more information to know that. There's just too many pieces of that puzzle. I would need to know more about, I would need to see the whole picture. And so I would have to, again, if this is coming from a particular parent, you can feel free to reach out to one of us. We'd be happy to kind of help walk through that and go from there. We have another question here. If a student is performing at or above grade level, gifted and with a lot of support at home, but is on the spectrum, does he, she still qualify for an IEP? Currently, student has, oops, sorry, it just jumped up. Currently, a student has an IEP, also has executive functioning skill and social emotional regulation challenges. Okay, wait, let me just read that back to myself for a second. The student is performing at or above grade level, but is still on the spectrum. Does he or she qualify for an IEP? Again, okay, sorry, Rachel, you wanted to jump in
No,
there?
I was just gonna say, it sounds like the student already has an IEP, so is
Correct, so
there?
that's what kind of threw me a little bit.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the student has an IEP, but again, this is one of those questions where I think I would like to look at it more specifically to the individual. And because again, looking, just because a student has a certain diagnosis doesn't automatically qualify you for, go ahead.
And I just want to add this twice exceptional piece. So a student who is in the gifted range and also has a diagnosed disability, that doesn't negate the possibility that they'll get this support. So on the flip side, the disability alone may or may not warrant an IEP. And on the flip side, if the student has a high level of cognitive functioning, it doesn't mean that they won't qualify for that level of support. So, I think to what Marcy said, a little bit more detail. And again, we'll all be happy to, if somebody wants to dump a question to all three of us afterwards, and we are happy to address that.
Yeah, I think the bottom line also is just, the question is how much is it interfering and what are the goals? And if the goals need to be addressed with certain services, accommodations, and modifications. I think there was another.
Oh, okay.
Another question up here about, I think, what we missed. If the IEP team has put accommodations and modifications in place to address social skills deficits that are in the IEP and nothing is working, goals continue to be unmet, what is the next step? I would say the next step would be, if you haven't already, to call an IEP meeting. That would be the first thing that you would need to do, and come armed with evidence. Unfortunately, in the state of Maryland, the burden is on us as parents to show that things aren't working. So I think it's imperative to do that. If you have any, evidence from, outside private practitioners, I always think it's helpful to have that on hand. But the first thing you want to do, because you're right, you can ask for an IEP meeting at any time. And believe me, I have taken upon myself to do that as a parent. And I highly encourage you to do so as well if you feel like the team is not in compliance on the IEP. But, I think it's a matter of, again, important, collaboration is key, communication is key. They need to know what's happening at home. If they don't already, the school, if there's information that your child is coming home with that's happening at school that the team is not aware of, I would definitely, if you haven't already, share that with the team. As Rachel and Marcy said before, it sounds like a little more of a specific question. So again, any of us are happy to chat with you offline about it.
Okay, I want to answer some of these questions before we start losing them as they go up. Real quick, the bottom one is, my student considered to be in special education if they have an IEP? The answer to that question is yes. How can I have my student with a 504 plan be evaluated by the school? So you can ask you can always ask for a meeting. And if you feel that your child needs to be evaluated, they can go back in and you can ask for another screening. And at any point in time, you as a parent can say you have some concerns and bring the team back together again and say, here are my concerns, here's what I feel is not working, and say, this is, and they can take a look and decide if further testing is necessary. If they decide that at that point further testing isn't necessary, then you always have the option of, paying for outside testing on your own. We can't there's no way to force a school to evaluate your child and provide testing, but we would absolutely encourage you to engage with the school and, to call a meeting if you feel that, your child's needs aren't being addressed. And then what if the school says they don't have sufficient staffing to provide the needed accommodations and or services? So that's a challenging one. I know that question has come up quite a bit, especially post-COVID, that there have been some staffing challenges. It's not just within MCPS, but we've heard that across the board in multiple counties. So first of all, we feel you, we hear you. That's definitely something that is frustrating. So I want to first say that. What I would first say to you is feel free to call central office and email to the central office after you contact your child's team if you're not getting a response from them. There is an obligation to ensure that your child is getting their needs met if they are in an IEP. So we want to, you'd want to make sure that that you find out what those, what the plan is, how the county is going to plan to get those needs met. And I don't think I missed any above there, but Rachel, Naomi, or Nora, or Sue, if I did, please let me know.
That's it. But initially there was one related question regarding staffing needs, and that was, is there some way we can find out about the critical staffing resources available at the middle school that our elementary school child is likely to move to before the child actually moves?
So that's a great question. So I'm pretty sure that data is available on the MCPS website by school. So if there's like a breakdown of the teachers and types of teachers, you should be able to find that out. I mean, you certainly can call the school, but I'm fairly certain, and feel free to email me. I'm happy to to dig in because I'm off the top of my head, and maybe Rachel or Marcy, you know the name of the document. Or maybe there's a parent on here that who knows the name of the document. You can put it in the chat, but I'm fairly certain that under, for each school, I don't think it's called at a glance. I think that's the population of the students. It will list the number of teachers, the number of paraeducators, the number of special educators, et cetera. So yes, you should be able to find that information.
Okay, so lastly, as promised, we wanted to make sure that we gave you some parent tips. These are what we call little goodies that we've sort of come across as we've been doing this, both as parents and as educators and as specialists in our field. So what we would encourage you to do is make sure that you read progress reports that are sent throughout the year. They're generally sent quarterly. If you have IEPs, and discuss these updates with your child as appropriate. So whether they're, report card comments, IEP comments, if they're progress updates, you want to make sure that you're going through those and maintaining a file of all the data and correspondence. Some people love to keep an electronic file. Some people still love to keep those 3-ring binders. Doesn't matter, but make sure that you're keeping those together because that's your documentation and you're the best keeper of that information. The schools have multiple students that they see, as you know, and your job is to really be in charge of your student. Save examples of your child's work and include notations of when and how assistance was provided versus when something was completed independently. I can't tell you how many times I've been to a meeting and the team says, well, every time, your child brings in their work or, the student brings in their assignments, it looks like everything's done correctly. And the parent says, yes, but we spent hours and hours working on this together, but it wasn't noted anywhere. So what I would encourage you to do is highlight or choose a marker to make sure that or write a little note to a teacher, or if you choose to send in an email, make sure you make a copy of that email and Xerox your child's work and then put that in your binder to bring in with you to your meeting so that you can demonstrate that, these 6 assignments were ones that we helped our child with, and this wasn't something that they can do independently. So that, then they can start providing accommodations or modifications if accommodations, were something already made. Make a list of questions and concerns in advance of any school meeting. So there's so much that's being talked about in a IEP meeting or a 504 meeting or in a screening. It's hard to intake all of that information and try to remember questions that you already had coming into the meeting. So if you have a list of questions or you have a list of concerns that you have in your little handy notebook, that would be really helpful to take with you. Note what's working and why, and communicate this to the team. It's great if you come in and you say, these 6 things are really working for your student, but to give them the reasons why they're working is so helpful and so relevant to the team and to your child, so they know how to move forward, and it allows them a way to figure out what they can do for the next set of accommodations or modifications or the next set of goals. We want to share any accommodations or recommendations from any outside providers or any testing that you may have gotten from any outside providers. That's also really helpful. If you can share that information in advance of the meeting, that's even more helpful. It gives the team time to read through that documentation so that they're coming in prepared to the meeting. Check in with your child to reflect with them on their experience prior to annual meetings. I always like to sit down about a week or 2 in advance with any of my clients or my students, and I like to talk to them about how the last semester or 2 goes. I like to come up with like a list of standard questions that I ask every so often so that I've got the same, it's the same questions, and I'm comparing apples to apples so that I can really hear what, and the students can really hear what it is that they are, if anything's changed. And so they can really reflect on what their experience is. And then ask the case manager to communicate to all teachers the reasoning behind all the accommodations and the modifications. There's a lot of students that might have extended time. There's a lot of students that might have flexible seating. There's a lot of students that might have preferential seating. We want to make sure that not only does the teacher know your student's name, they know and know their accommodation, but we want them to know the why, the relevance behind why they have this accommodation, and so that it becomes more meaningful to them. So those are just some tips that we think would be helpful, that we have found along the way to be so helpful. If you have any other questions, we would be thrilled to answer them. Please feel free to get in touch with us at any time. We are been so delighted to be here with all of you. We are here for another few minutes if anybody has any extra questions.
I would like to read out one more question. How should I respond to IEP team members who recommend that they work on skills at home? What's the responsibility of parents to provide private support for skill development?
It's a really good question. So frankly, if the school is recommending specific things are done, it's actually the obligation of the school to meet those needs. So yes, as a parent, you want to know what would be helpful to work on at home. But if they're saying something very, very specific is needed that they can't work on at school, then they're obligated to provide that service once they communicate that. Rachel and Marcy, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that is, Naomi, I think what you're saying is absolutely true. I think that there are times where parents, if you feel that in addition to what they're receiving at school, that you feel that there is extra, that your student would benefit from individual, help and private guidance, I think that that's something that you can feel free to, research and, reach out to outside professionals. I don't think that, I think those are two separate things. I think one is the school suggesting it, and then one is the parent saying, hey, this is something that I think would be helpful. I think that we want to just differentiate those two pieces.
I hope that answers that question. In terms of, I don't know if it's something, like, oh, Sam is having trouble with this particular concept in math versus, yeah, I think he would really benefit from a math tutor. To Marcy's point, that those are two totally different things. And obviously, if we as parents want to provide that, we can. But once they say it out loud, they're obligated to do it.
Okay. Sue, did you want to share the information we have coming up in regards to the basic series?
Yeah, I would. First of all, thank you so much, Marcy, Rachel, and Naomi. That was a lot of great information and delivered so clearly. Thank you so much. I want to invite everybody in our audience to complete a quick 2-question feedback form. To get to that feedback form, use either the link that Annie has put in the chat or the QR code that's right there now. We've recorded this presentation, and I'm going to email you a link to the recording in the next few days, as well as a link to the slides. So I'm really hoping everyone will join us for the next speaker event, which is just later this week, when Marcy and Rachel will be back to talk about how to address executive function challenges for students on the spectrum. That will be a lunchtime event at noon on Friday, January 13th.
Rachel, can you go back a slide?
And also the next speaker event in our special education basics series will be a 2-night event reviewing all the special education programs in MCPS where autistic students are commonly placed. So that's going to be Tuesday, February 7th and Thursday, February 9th. The speakers at that will all be MCPS staff talking about their own programs. So if you have a child on the spectrum in MCPS, this will be an important event for you to come to. So we've got 2 really good things coming up. One, January 13th, this Friday with Marcy and Rachel. And then the next one is going to be February 7th and 9th, all about MCPS placements. So stick with us, come back, and the links to register for all those are in the chat. And just thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And once again, thank you to our panelists. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure.